Hi, thank you for watching this video. I'm kgd-al and I'm going to present you our work on emergent communication in an artificial life context. This work is part of the agent-based modeling of human behavior workshop held at the Alive 2021 conference. So the context of this work is that for decades we have created virtual agents, some of which can interact with human users on an emotional level, and not necessarily because they model emotions, but because they can elicit emotional responses from these users. For instance, we have the example of reducing elderly isolation by engaging in casual conversation, or promoting mental health by virtual activities with pets. However, when viewing the human brain with a top-down approach, we are faced with a tremendous complexity that, for instance, in the work of Ledoux, which focuses on emotion, results in a large number of interacting components, each of which is also a very complex component. For instance, long-term memory is something that's quite well understood, but is incredibly complex in itself. So what we argue in this work is that a bottom-up approach is not only complementary but necessary, because it will allow discoveries with a much finer granularity. So we placed our individuals in a survival context and we asked two questions. First, does communication help discriminate between friends and foes? And is this convergent or divergent with biology? Is this something that we can observe in the real world, or is it something new? So very briefly, I'm going to detail the main components of the model. I urge you to have a look at the related article, which goes in much more details, or have a look at the pre-recorded version. Each creature is composed of a central body, on which are placed a number of sensors, one ear on each side, which responds to frequencies, and two retinas, which responds to colors. They have a pair of motors for locomotion, forward, backward, and rotation, and they have a mouth for vocalization. Each of these inputs and outputs are placed on a two-dimensional Cartesian substrate, where the inputs are placed at the bottom and the outputs at the top. The methodology to go from such an unconnected collection of neurons to a fully functional artificial neural network is based on the evolvable substrate hyperlink algorithm, which succinctly postulates that regions of high informational density are these locations where hidden neurons should be instantiated. So through this methodology, both the connectivity and the topology of the artificial neural network can be evolved with a single genomic component. The evolution part is based on a number of scenarios. The easiest, simplest one is just a subject on the left side having to reach a goal in green. More complex scenarios involve the appearance of another individual, either a harmless clone of the subject, which is an ally, or a predator, which will actively seek the subject and try and capture it. In the final case, both individuals are present, transforming the task into a discrimination task, because the food is always on the ally's side. If the individual does reach the goal, it's hugely rewarded. If it does not reach the goal, then an incentive is provided so that it can go closer and closer, and if it's captured by a predator, then a large penalty is imposed. We performed 1,000 generations and 50 replicates in order to have an overview of the phenotypical landscape. However, these resulting artificial neural networks are of large complexity. They are quite dense and not straightforward to analyze. So what we did is that we expose each of these neurons to very simple stimulus, in this case the enemy, and we take note of which neurons are activated when faced with this stimuli. We repeat the procedure for different types of stimuli, And by aggregating individual tags, we can obtain a modular version of the artificial neural network. The scenario on which we evaluate these individuals are quite different from those used in the evolution. They are much simpler and only consist of alternating either between empty and ally operator, or alternance between a predator and an ally. We specifically focus on the last case because it's going to be used in the future results by adding either an invisible ally that can still communicate or a mute ally that can still be seen. So we obtained communication. For instance, here we have the simplest case of communication, that is a binary mode. When both the ally and the individual can see one another, they emit a continuous maximal loudness signal throughout the phase. Phase 2 and phase 4, which are those where the ally is present. However, when the ally is invisible, the subject fails to communicate. If it does not see the ally, it does not emit any sound. More interestingly is that when the ally is visible but mute, the individual still tries to communicate with it, but undergoes a drastic change in the modular activity, specifically the predator model. Indeed, it stays active at a very high level throughout the evaluation. We can see these dynamics in the individual artificial neural networks and in their modular versions on the bottom row. When faced with an invisible ally, you can see that the neural network stays in a quiescent state. In case of the mute ally, we see that a small portion of the neural network focused on predator stimuli stays active, whereas it is deactivated in the standard case. Indeed, we can trace back this change in dynamics to this single neuron under the cursor that responds to auditory cues and is not deactivated in case of a mute ally, thereby causing the excessive fear response. Another case of communication, a more complex one, is illustrated here through a kind of structured communication. Initially, the individual performs a short query, which is later on answered by the ally. No further communication is observed in this fourth phase. However, when the ally is invisible, then the query changes and becomes a continuous emission, which does not elicit a response. So the dynamic change in the fourth phase with a different type of query, which in this case does elicit a response. Finally, when the ally cannot answer because it's been artificially muted, we see that the initial period is the same, an attempt at communication which fails, there are no responses. So later on, the individual tries and performs a different type of query by pinging twice. Indeed, when we have a look at the dynamics of the artificial neural network, we can see that they are drastically different from the previous case. The topology is much more complex, and more interestingly, we can see that very different regions of the brain are active depending on the stimuli. Moreover, we can see that most models are quiescent when faced with an invisible ally. So these individuals still make a strong use of visual cues, but has observable synergies between both the subject and the ally through a form of structured communication. So in this work, we performed a kind of open-ended evolution on an artificial life dinner paradox. What we had was the emergence of rudimentary social behavior with individuals communicating with one another. Most used passive communication based on visual cues, the color of the front, but structured communication was also observed. In later work, we proposed to focus on a three-dimensional substrate which should help discriminating between similar modes and enforcing local constraints so that modules are not only functionally but also spatially defined. And we expect these modifications to increase the potential for communication, but the most important part is to change the experiment into a more complex one. And to this end, we'll focus on ranged battles between hundreds of individuals. In this case, communication will be an essential tool to coordinate between individuals and to adapt to the changing conditions of life battlefield. Thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me.